Alright, so here's our video lecture for pregnancy, growth, and development. This is our last chapter. Right off the bat, I don't want you to panic when you open this up and you saw that there were multiple parts. The program I'm using to record these, I'm using the free version, so I can only do 15-minute videos. So, like, if you see 8 parts, don't panic, because, 8 times 15 is just a 2-hour lecture, which is kind of like normal. I don't know how long it'll be, but just in case you were intimidated when you saw that. Alright, so in the last chapter we did reproduction. So what we're going to look at is when reproduction happens, what happens after that. Pregnancy, growth, and development. So just so we are familiar with these terms, the term pregnancy is the presence of a developing offspring in the uterus. I think we know what that means, but it's good just to have an anatomy definition for that. So while the offspring is inside the uterus, the woman would be considered pregnant. Growth, that term, it's not really related. Growth means an increase in the size, and it entails an increase in the cell numbers and cell size. So I think we mentioned in class that you were not the same size right now as you were when you were born. Hopefully, for the sake of your mother, you were much smaller when you were delivered. So what that means is when we grow, as we increase in our body size, we're going to do that, number one, limited amount because our cells get bigger. So sometimes your actual cells do increase in size. But the biggest way that we're going to grow is we're going to increase the number of cells that are in our body. So when you were born, you were about 1 trillion cells. As we're adults, we're closer to, I think it's like 40 trillion cells. So we really increase the number of cells that we're made up of. All right, I want you to do a quick review from the reproductive chapter. We spent a lot of time talking about meiosis, which was the production of sex cells. So if you wanted to sketch some notes out to the side real quick, just as a reminder of this, meiosis was the production of sex cells. So whether we were making sperm cells or egg cells, that was called meiosis. So meiosis is important during the reproductive cycle, obviously, because we have to make sperm cells and egg cells. After fertilization happens, so once the sperm cell and the egg cell meet each other, mitosis, M-I-T-O-S-I-S, mitosis becomes more important because that one fertilized egg has to develop into 2. And those 2 eggs have to reproduce into 4. So if you wanted to write down, remember our definition for mitosis was regular cell reproduction. Regular cell reproduction just means that the cells are reproducing normally. So that one fertilized egg reproduces and becomes 2 cells. And those 2 cells reproduce and become 4 cells. And those 4 cells become 8, 8 becomes 16, and so on until by the time that 9 months or a little over 9 months has passed, we have a almost trillion-celled newborn. Mitosis is responsible for growth. And we wrote that last time. If you wanted to, underneath your definition for mitosis, if you just wrote that, you can write down growth, repair, and maintenance. So that's the functions of mitosis, is growth, repair, and maintenance. So I know that can be kind of tricky, but don't get those confused. Meiosis is how we made the sex cells. Mitosis is after fertilization occurred. Mitosis is how growth took place. Alright, so along with growth is development. And development is the continuous process by which an individual changes from one life phase to another. Alright, so growth basically just means we're getting bigger. But we don't just get bigger. We develop and we mature. So that is development. The difference between a newborn and an adult is not like you're a whole lot bigger. Hopefully you've developed a little bit more. So you have bowel control. You have developed speech and language. You can think and reason. So development means that we're progressing from one stage to another, from infancy to adolescence, to childhood to adolescence to adulthood, and so on. All right? Okay, so transport of sex cells. We're going to pick up right where the reproductive system left off. It says fertilization. That term is the union of an egg cell. And remember that the technical term we had for egg cell was a secondary oocyte. So it's the union of a secondary oocyte and a sperm cell. So when they combine with each other, that is fertilization. It says this figure shows the path of the egg cell and the sperm cell through the female reproductive tract. So I believe we talked about this in the reproductive chapter, but just in case, I want you to notice, so what we have here, the egg, or our secondary oocyte right here, is released from the ovary, so that's where it's labeled. And then after intercourse, we have semen deposited in the vagina during intercourse. So most of that semen is in the vagina, and it gets kind of stopped at the cervix, because remember, that's a really narrow opening. So, but some of that, the sperm cells that are in that semen, are going to make their way through the cervix into the uterus. So there's anywhere from 2 to like 4 million sperm cells that are released during intercourse at ejaculation, but only 100 or so of them are actually going to make it to the egg, to the secondary oocyte. So they're going to travel in the uterus, they're going to make their way through the uterine tubes, and then fertilization typically occurs in the uterine tube, somewhere right around this, if you can see where I'm highlighting, somewhere in this area inside the uterine tubes is where fertilization occurs. All right, so that's important to note too. Fertilization isn't happening in the uterus usually. It's definitely not happening in the vagina or anything like that. Typically where those sperm cells and those egg cells are actually going to come in contact with each other and fertilization occurs is going to be somewhere in the uterine tubes. That's not always the case. Sometimes you'll hear of it happening in other places. There are also some cases, and these typically are not successful, although you'll hear some really weird cases where they are. But sometimes the sperm and the egg cell will actually meet outside of the uterine tube, somewhere around here, and the embryo can implant somewhere else in the body, so like actually in the pelvic cavity. If you've heard of an ectopic pregnancy, that's when fertilization occurs and the embryo implants somewhere else in the body. Again, typically those are not successful, but you will hear some really kind of rare case studies where that can occur and be successful. All right, kind of a note, let's see, I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I have some Word documents pulled up here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some additional notes on here. So this would be like if we were in a classroom and I'm writing notes on a board. So anything I type here, you would want to write this down. So what we're going to talk about is how long those sex cells are viable. Viable means that they are going to be able to survive before fertilization occurs. And if fertilization does not occur, that means that these cells are going to mostly disintegrate, or they're just going to die off. Right? So the egg cell, the secondary oocyte, that egg cell, after fertilization occurs, it is going to be viable typically somewhere around 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. So that means once the secondary oocyte leaves the ovary and it's in the female reproductive system, it has 12 to 24 hours to get fertilized. If it does not get fertilized within that time period, then it's going to disintegrate and it would leave the body through the next menstrual cycle. Sperm, on the other hand, they are viable anywhere from usually around 48 hours in the female reproductive system. Okay, 48 hours within the female reproductive system. So definitely write those down. But here's why this is significant. If you remember, towards the end of the reproductive system, we talked about different forms of birth control. And one of the forms of birth control we talked about was the rhythm method, where you can check the female's body temperature every day. Typically, the body temperature is going to elevate right before ovulation. And you would avoid intercourse if you were not wanting to get pregnant. You would avoid intercourse. You have to do this several months to figure out when it's going to spike, and then you have to predict, like, oh, in 2 days the temperature is about to spike. That means ovulation is about to occur. The reason that I'm going through all this is because if you'll notice, the sperm cells can be viable in the female reproductive system for 2 days before they die. So that means that if you have intercourse, let's say a day and a half before ovulation, when that secondary oocyte leaves the ovary, the sperm could still be viable in the female reproductive system, even though you haven't had sex for a day before. When that egg is ovulated, those sperm are still in the female reproductive system. All right. Same thing with the egg is viable 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. So if you know ovulation has occurred one day, you can't say, oh, tomorrow we can start having sex again and not have to worry about fertilization, because that egg can still be viable for about 24 hours. Okay? All right, so there we go. Fertilization is going to occur here. After fertilization, the fertilized egg, or we can call that the zygote, is going to make its way through the uterine tubes, and then implantation typically occurs in the uterus, is where that fertilized egg is going to embed into the embryo. And we'll look at the timeline on some of those things. All right, so fertilization, how this happens. Remember, our sperm cell, if you look down at the picture, the bottom picture, you can see kind of a close-up of what that sperm cell looks like. It's got the tail was the flagellum. It's got the round yellow section right here is the mid piece. That's where we've got mitochondria that are having ATP and energy. And then the head, the blue section of the sperm cell, that's where the chromosomes are found. That's where the male's DNA is found. And then lastly, that pink cap looks like a purple, like a toboggan that's sitting on the head. What that is called the acrosome. And it has enzymes that are going to be able to eat away at the outer layer of the egg. So let's read through this. It says the sperm reaches the corona radiata. Corona radiata, if you wanted to write down, it's a layer of follicular cells surrounding the secondary oocyte. Layer of follicular cells surrounding the secondary oocyte. All right. Phil, I meant to mention this earlier, but feel free, if I give a note and you didn't have enough time, you've got a pause button, so feel free to use that to get your notes in, and you can rewind and listen to it again. All right, so that layer of follicular cells surrounding the secondary oocyte, that means that those are the cells that have not developed yet. If you remember, all of the beginning cells are in the ovary already. And then after puberty, during each cycle, one of those cells, or two, it can be more than that, are going to develop and mature. So those are all the cells that haven't been developed yet, or all of those cells, follicular cells around the secondary oocyte. So sperm cells can move through those, but when we get to the next layer, so right here it says zona pellucida, that is the outer layer of the secondary oocyte, or the outer layer of the egg. All right. Now, we want to make sure that only one sperm cell can fertilize the egg. If it's more than that, there can be issues. We spend a lot of time talking about the male donates one set of chromosomes, the female donates one set of chromosomes. If two sperm cells could fertilize the egg, that's two sets of chromosomes from dad and one set of chromosomes from mom. That's too many chromosomes, so that would be an issue. So what that zona pellucida does, it's an outer layer that protects the egg to make sure that multiple sperm can't go through. So it's hard, protective layer. The acrosome, that was the purple toboggan-looking cap on top of the head of the sperm cell, the enzymes that are found there are going to penetrate, or they're going to eat through that layer, and that allows the sperm to enter the secondary oocyte. And that's what that next bullet point says. Head of the portion of the sperm enters the secondary oocyte. Enzymes from the egg harden the zona pellucida. So what that means is as soon as that first sperm enters the egg goes, okay, I got my one set of chromosomes. I do not need any more, because that would lead to issues. So as soon as that first sperm breaches that layer, then the layer is going to get hard, and that's going to prevent any other sperm from entering. So the first one makes it, all of the other ones are permanently going to be blocked out. The sperm's nucleus enters the oocyte's cytoplasm. Remember, oocyte's just the egg cell. So the nucleus is where the DNA is. DNA from the sperm enters the inside of the egg cell. The egg now completes second meiosis and produces a large egg and a second polar body. So if that's kind of confusing, you might want to go back and review the female part of the reproductive system. But remember, when the egg cell goes through meiosis, we're going to produce first time we produce one primary oocyte, and then a polar body is just a collection of, is a little small section, you can see it up here in the picture, that we're going to get rid of the extra chromosomes that we don't need. So when ovulation occurs, meiosis has not completed yet. So after the sperm makes its way into the egg, then we complete. And then finally it says the pronuclei, which is the nucleus from the sperm and egg, are going to unite and fertilization is complete. So we get DNA from both cells. All right, so there's part one. We'll pick up on part two next.